Hi everyone, in this video we're going to start building shells. And first I want to go over the different types of shells and a little bit about the basics about how they're made, and then we'll get into to the building. Okay, so there's two types of shells, and one is a ball shell shown here. There's various sizes of those. And these are typically Chinese made, and these are, I guess, the more common that you shoot professionally, or at least that we shoot professionally. And here is a cross section of a ball shell. So basically, internally around the outer edge, you have your stars, and you can have several layers of stars, and we'll go into that later. And in the very center you have a burst charge. Going up into the burst charge you have a time fuse, and it is lit when the lift charge is lit at the bottom of it. So you can see the quick match at the top. When that's lit, it goes around the shell down into the lift charge, ignites the lift charge, and then it also ignites the time fuse. And as it's going up in the air, then the time fuse is burning. Once it hits the end of the time fuse, then the shell's going to go off. So it's timed to go off at the peak of the height that you're launching it. So all that has to be calculated when you're building. Okay, the next type of shell that you'll encounter is a cylinder shell. These are more Italian style shells, and a lot of people like to build cylinder shells because they're just different the way they're constructed. And this is a cross section of the cylinder shells, and it's pretty much the same thing as far as, you've got your stars in there, and you've got your burst charge. You'll have a time fuse, and you'll have a lift charge. The construction of these, however, you end up having to do what's called spiking, and you wrap it basically in a pattern with string to strengthen the shell. And we're just going to be doing ball shells now. Maybe later on we'll get into some cylinder shells, but that's what I'm comfortable with building right now, are ball shells. And the reason that you spike these, and the same reason that you tape the ball shells, is that the more you can contain the explosion, the more explosive power there is from the explosion of the shell. So you try to contain it as much as possible. And we'll get into that a little bit more as we go along. Okay, so here's a little chart that shows you the size of stars based on the size of shells that you're using. So typically on a 3-inch shell, you'll have a 1/4 inch or smaller star size. And if you're going to have a tail, then that would be a 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch. And so it goes up to, 1/8 inch shell, you would have a 1/2 inch or larger stars. And that's one of the problems I had starting off with my shells, is that I tried to do too big of stars, and so the burst pattern just did not look good because there's not enough stars going off. So it's a good idea to stick to this, to the sizes here, to get a nice break pattern. Okay, now to show you some of the shell casings. And usually these are bought in pairs, so when you buy a quantity of one, it would be a pair. So they come in all different sizes, of course. These would be 1.5 inch. These would be 2 inch. These would be for 3-inch shells. And you'll notice that these are not exactly 3 inches. These are smaller because we're going to be building the outside of these up with tape when they're complete. So the finished size will be, right much, maybe a 1/4 inch larger than this. These are 3-inch shells. And by the way, also these are available in plastic. And so these are 3-inch plastic casing. And I prefer to use paper because they would be biodegradable. It's a little simpler and quicker to build plastic ones because you don't have to go through the same drying process and taping process. Okay, and these are some small plastic ones that you would use for inserts. For instance, you might want to use flash powder in these for small salutes, even inside the shells. Okay, also have 6-inch casings. These are 8-inch casings. These are 10-inch. And I even have 12-inch. These are big boys. We will not be getting into these. First of all, they take a lot of stars and they take a lot of powder to lift them. So we will be getting into, first of all, 3s and 4s. And later on we'll go in and do some actual, maybe some different kinds of inserts in the shells. But right now we'll primarily focus on these two, which are probably the more common sizes that you'll be, if you shoot professional shows, that you'll be handling. Okay, before we get into the building of the shells, I wanted to show you a 1.3 or a professional shell, and this is what they look like. First of all, the base of the shell is the lift charge. You've got your quick match that goes down in, and speaking of quick match, on the end here there is a plastic port, and this would be used to insert an electronic match if you're electrically firing the show or the shell. The red cover here is covering a piece of visco fuse, slow burning, that goes down into the quick match. So if you're hand firing, you can light the visco. That gives you time to get away before it hits the quick match and ignites the shell. So you always want to keep those covered. On top of the shell is a tail, and really all it is another star that's coated, so it will it's coated with a slurry, so it will ignite from the gases in the tube. But this is what you'll see going up, the streak of light going up when the shell launches. And sometimes they'll have whistles, but and a lot of times in a show you don't want a tail, because you just want the effect in the air when it's choreographed. This is a 3-inch shell, as you can see. It's also, there'll be a sticker on it that tells you, first of all, who manufactured it, who imported it, and the type of shell. So this is half orange and grass green peony is the effect of this shell. This is a Lido shell. So this is what professional shells look like. And ours will look close to that, actually, without the stickers. Okay, getting into that. Okay, these are some of the items that we'll be using to construct the shell. Of course, we'll have our shell halves. And I like to use couplings, PVC pipe couplings, to actually help stabilize the shell halves. And they, they're readily available at hardware stores, and that just keeps the shell half from rolling around on you while you're trying to work with it. Okay, you'll notice this one has a hole in it, and that was done with our hole punch on over top of wood with our mallet. And the reason for the hole is so we can have a tube, which is called a spoolette, that contains our time fuse. So we'll be putting that inside, hot gluing it in, and then putting, when we get ready to put the lift on, we'll insert the time fuse, and that's what this is a piece of time fuse. These are timed typically at 3 seconds per inch, and so depending on the shell size, you have to calculate how long you want this to go before it goes off in the air. So we'll get into that later. This is a lift cup, pre-made lift cup that we'll be putting our lift charge in, and of course our hot glue gun. This is our quick match that we'll be using when we get ready to put the lift in. And of course we'll be using 2 2FA black powder for both inside for the burst and for the lift. And then whatever stars you want to use. In this case, I think we'll use our small, well, 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch really cut stars that we made. And we'll also be using tissue paper, and you can see this is Christmas tissue paper because I save everything. And it's just, instead of buying it, just save it from presents. And that saves you some on costs. We'll also have gum tape that we'll use to tape the shell once it's finished. And we'll get into that later and show you how that's done. Okay, time to actually get into making some shells. So, first shell we're going to do is the 4 inch, and we're going to use our cut stars from earlier. And the first thing I'm going to do is, I had already punched the hole in this shell half, and I've got this small 1/4 inch tube I'm going to stick through here. And what you try to do is, well, first of all, the tube is used to pass fire to the center of your shell. So we'll be sticking the time fuse up in here when we get ready to fuse it and put the lift in there. So your time fuse is not going to stick all the way up in here, so we're also going to put a section of some quick match, or black match actually, sticking up out of here. So this will pass the fire to that and then ignite your brake in there. So what I like to do is put it slightly lower than the halfway point. I'm sorry, slightly lower than the halfway point, so you've got room for the quick match to stick up in there close to the center of your shell. And I'll just let it stick out however much at the bottom. I'll trim that off later. Next I'll take my hot glue, and I'm going to glue around the bottom of this. Now, this is extremely important that you seal this well. And the reason for that is the gases from the lift charge, if they get past this tube, they're going to ignite your shell before it leaves the tube. So I'm going to put an ample amount around this tube here and on the outside of the bottom. And then we'll end up, well, it'll help stabilize this while we're building the shell, but I'll end up cutting this off. We'll put our time fuse in there, and then I'll end up putting more hot glue around that time fuse. So you've got to make sure that the opening is sealed off for the gases when the shell is launched. So I'll set that there and let that. I'll turn my heat gun off. I'll let that dry while we start on this half of the shell. So what we want to do is take our stars, and the idea here is to put one layer of stars around inside the shell half, and you try to get them as spaced as evenly as possible in there with no gaps, because a small gap here relates to a large area of the sky that doesn't have a star in it. And so I usually just dump some in and then start working from there, trying to move them around. And you know, these cut stars were not exactly all even, and so I will try to pick through and take out some that's not that's different size, that may be too small, until I actually get any holes in here that I'm trying to fill, and then I'll go back in and fill some of that in. So I'll just remove some of these that look a little bit too big, and then we'll just start trying to get an even layer of this inside inside here. Now, pump stars are going to look a little better, and they're going to fill in a little better and more evenly than the cut stars, but they're going to burn this. You know, they're going to burn the same, and really you probably won't notice the difference in the sky. So we'll just keep going. I'll selectively pick, And we want to keep it down below the edge of the center point, so when the shell halves go together, there's nothing sticking up in the way to keep them from joining. So we'll just keep picking stars that will fit, and you know, take your time doing this. There's no hurry like anything else in fireworks, and try to fill in every little gap you can, and we'll keep going until we get this all filled up. Okay, so I've got all my stars put in on both halves, and now I've got some of my tissue paper, and I've kind of cut it into shape and balled it up so it'll be a little more flexible. And what we're going to do is put this down in each half to separate the brake charge from the stars, and to basically keep them in place so they don't fall apart while the shell's being handled or moved around. And I'll do the same on both sides as far as putting this in. And you'll notice I cut a little hole in this one to fit over our spillet, and we'll tuck that down in there softly, easily, without trying to disturb your stars. Okay, then we're going to put 2FA powder in here for our brake. So I'll put a little bit at a time in there and try to press it down. Keep the stars in place. Put some more in that half. And one thing that people also do is you take rice hulls and you coat those in black powder, and you use those in place of the granular powder. And especially on larger shells, it takes so much room, and it really doesn't take, it's more powder than you would need for breaking it, so you can take up some of the room with the rice hulls. Okay, so I'm going to put this on both sides. Try to keep this out of my split. And you can actually fold this in a little bit to get it out of the way. But you can see our stars are still in place around the edge. And you want to fill these up where they'll be tight when they're put together. So you really don't want it loose where the stars can move around to keep your pattern nice. So we'll keep adding that in there till we get it pretty much even with the top. Now before I finish this one, I want to go ahead and put some quick match down in here, and the time fuse will pass the fire from that to the quick match and set off the burst charge. So I'll take some quick match, and I'll cut a section of that, and we'll take the black match out of that. Okay, and this black match happens to be in single strands, so it makes it a little bit easier to work with. But basically we want to make sure that this is in there nice and tight. And a lot of times you can actually put this in and then tape around the spillet with this sticking out to keep it from going down in there. But I've found that if you put right much in there and then fold over the top of these, then it's pretty much going to keep it from going any further down in there. Okay, so those are spread out now. Those are not in any danger of falling through. And I'll continue putting powder around to fill these up. Make sure everything's packed in nice and tight. Now, one last thing we're going to do is we're going to use a little burst charge just to give it a little extra lighting ease. So we'll put, half a teaspoon or so on each side. Okay, the burst charge is actually made from 75% potassium chlorate and 25% airflow charcoal. And you can also bind it with a little dextrin, 2 or 3%. And that should be it as far as what we put in there. So it's a pretty simple shell. If we wanted to have a separate pedal, then we could have put another row of stars, maybe a different color, inside the tissue, and then put more tissue in, and then put the burst charge. But this should blow pretty hard with this much powder in it, and it should keep the stars in place nicely. Okay, next we need to put these together. And before I do that, I usually like to have some pieces of tape handy to stick it together temporarily until I can put gum tape on it. So I'll tear me off some pieces of this and set it aside where I can get to them. And this is just our tape that used for packing. Like I said, I get this from where you can buy U-Haul supplies. It's the cheapest place to buy this. Okay, so what I like to use is saran wrap to put over these shells while I put them together. So I just tear a piece of saran wrap, we'll lay it across the shell half, and then we'll tighten it up. Set that one aside. We'll do the same to this half. A lot of people use tissue in place of this, so your material stays in place while you put the halves together. But this works just as well as, and actually better, of holding it in place, and you can tighten it down and hold on to it a little better as you put the halves together. Now we'll tear off whatever is sticking over, and the saran wrap won't matter when the fire hits. It's just going to be instantly melted, so it's not going to affect anything with that. So once the two are wrapped and tight, you just want to slap them together, line the shell halves up, and then typically, to make sure everything is settled well, especially if it's not closing tightly, believe it or not, we're going to hammer on it or tap on it, which freaked me out to begin with, but that's the best way to settle everything where it'll close tightly. And once the halves are together tightly, we'll go ahead and start tearing off our saran wrap while we hold these pieces tightly in place. So I'll tear back part of that while holding it, and I will temporarily tape this in place
as we go around. I'll remove that when we get ready to do our gum tape, and then put gum tape in its place. You want to make sure you get it a tight seal. Okay, so let me put a couple more pieces, fill in these little spots, and then this will be sealed well. I won't have to worry about anything falling out of it until we can get to taping it. Okay, so we're also going to turn this over, and I'll probably trim this off before we start taping it, but for the moment I'm going to tape over that so there's no chance of fire getting in there or anything falling out. So now it's together tightly. Barely hear a little bit of maybe rattling, but you want it nice and tight. You don't want any of your stars moving on you, and that will assure a nice break pattern when it goes off. Okay, so next we'll start taping this and show you how that's done. And like I said, the reason we tape it is to build up the thickness and to bind the shell more, because the more we can contain the explosion, the stronger the explosion will be. And if we didn't put much in here, even though we had a lot of powder in there, it would just bust open and wouldn't spread the stars out, or the fire for that matter. So that's what we'll do next. We'll get some gum tape and we'll start taping this. Okay, so here's a chart showing the shell and mortar sizes. So you can see that our 4-inch shell, the circumference of it is 12.56 inches, and the inside diameter of the mortar will be 4 inches. So we have to be careful not to get the overall size of the shell too large to fit in the tube. Okay, so here is our 4-inch shell that we finished putting together. I went ahead and cut the top of the spillet off, retaped that, and then I pulled the tape that we had off, holding it together, off, and put a strip of gum tape around there to hold it in shape. So I went ahead and drew black lines around it, kind of indicating the axes that we'll be taping, using to tape by. And there's a pattern to this that you need to follow to get an even amount of tape around it. And what I did is I went ahead and cut some strips ahead of time, and you can see that it's enough to go around and overlap just a little bit. And as it gets bigger, of course, they'll have to be a little longer, but that's what I've got to begin with. Okay, and also I've got just a plate with a sponge that's soaked with water. And I usually keep a little container like this with water in it, so I can just set my sponge in it to get it wet, and then set it back in the plate here. And the way you do this is the tape, you can see it's the shiny side, dull side. So the shiny side has actual gum on it, and that's activated when it's wet. So I just simply lay it on the sponge, hold it down, and just slide it across to wet it. So you can see it's a little bit wetter. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is go around this axis. Okay, so once I get that stuck on, I want to try to smooth it down a little bit. And then we'll come back in a couple of minutes and actually really smooth them out. Okay, so then the next one I want to follow the other axis. So I'll start back, Lay it down there, hold it down, and pull it across the sponge. Okay, so we'll go around this axis. So you can see that we've got spaces here that we haven't covered, and it leaves each one of those is equal. So next what we want to do for this pattern is we want to turn it and start on the side filling these in. So depending on the size of your tape is how much it's going to take to fill in. You don't want your tape too wide because it gets too wrinkly. If it's too small, then it's it takes so much more to wrap it. And the tape, by the way, is available in different widths. So I'll tape it here. It should cover over there like that, and equally cover two sections at a time. Okay, so I'll get one more piece here. And you'll notice I'm using the that section of pipe coupling to set this on. It's a lot easier. It doesn't roll around on the table with you. We're also going to use it in a minute to smooth the shell. So here again, we're going to wet our tape. One more, and it'll finish our first little coating or wrapping. Okay, so now we have it completely covered the first go round. So we have one full layer, and I'll take this little coupling section, and I'll roll it across the shell to help flatten it down and lay down any of the little wrinkles on it. And if you have areas that still don't want to stick good, you can just wet them a little bit till you get them to lay down. Okay, so that is the first coating there. Okay, so next we're going to do a little bit different on our axis. This time we're going to follow in this direction an axis, and in this direction an axis off the top. So we're not concerned with the actual edge of the hemis there, that section. So these are going to be our new axes for this go round of wrapping. Okay. So we will once again do our axes first. Okay, so this time it leaves more vertically an opening, and you really have to pay attention because it gets to the point where it's hard to tell where you've been and where you need to go. So you really have to pay attention as you go along. So once again, we need to fill in those areas. Okay, so we can see here is our next little section that needs to be filled in. Okay, and one more to complete this layer. Okay, so there is layer number 2. Okay, and we'll go ahead and burnish it. I guess that's what that's called. Smooth it out. Okay, so that is an additional layer, and this is really, I would consider this as basically one layer, one full layer, because we've got the way it's done with both directions. And typically you'll need to do this about 5 times to get the thickness. And just get a to keep up with it too, just get a tape. Paper tape is a lot easier to go around, and then you can just measure and say, well, it's not quite enough. You know, right now this is 11.5 inches in diameter, and remember that the true diameter of a 4-inch or the circumference is 12.5 inches. So we have a ways to go still before it won't fit in the tube. So we'll just keep doing that and till we get it all done. And then it will need to dry in the heat box again to make sure it's completely dry before we go on with it. And I left a little bit of the spilette sticking out just to make it easier to tell where it is, because later we're going to have to come back and cut that out to put our time fuse in. So that's the basics of wrapping this. I'm going to go ahead and continue till I get it fully wrapped, and then I'll come back and show you what it looks like. Okay, so here is my wrapped shell, still wet, and I measured it, and just a little bit over 12-inch diameter, so that gives us maybe 3/8 of an inch play in our tube. And by the time we get the lift cut put on and we get the quick match run up the side, then that'll be about as large as it needs to be. So I'm gonna put this in the dryer box, let it dry. Then we'll come back and I'll show you how to finish it off. Okay, so once the shell is dried, it's ready to get ready for firing. And what I went ahead and did was cut into where the spilette entered the shell, and I put the time fuse in and hot glued it in place. And like I said, it's very important to get enough hot glue around to seal this so the hot gases do not get up inside this. You'll notice it also has some pieces of quick match stuck through here, and it's called cross matching. That just helps it get fire better and to light the time fuse. And okay, to prepare your time fuse, you want to cut the appropriate length for the 3.5 second delay. And remember that the delay is going to start from the bottom of your hole here where we cross match it. So make sure from there down is your delay length. And you just simply poke a hole through there, however you can get it with an awl, or you can actually buy a tool that does that. We're going to cut a couple of pieces of black match, a couple of strands, and stick those through the hole, bring it up about halfway. Okay. Then we're going to tie that off to make sure it doesn't move during movement of the shell, and this is going to just make sure that it lights easily. All right, so to secure that with string, first of all, this is our typical cotton string that we use, and you need to tie a clove hitch. Clove hitch is the typical knot that you use in fireworking. The best way I've found to do it for this is to take it and rotate to the right to form a loop, rotate this one to the right to form a loop, and you put that one behind the first one. Okay, then when it's tightened down, you don't have to knot it, and that's the deal about a clove hitch. It's just easier to tighten. So I'll put that across, and you can more easily tie it with one hand as well, or tighten it with one hand. So once that's secured, then that's nice and tight, not going to go anywhere. All right, then we'll cut the excess off, and then it'll be ready to put into the shell. Okay, so that is how that's prepared. Okay, now lift charge. Okay, I'm going to use pre-made lift cups. Makes it a little easier. And the amount of lift that we're going to use is I usually just, well, you can, first of all, people weigh them and use 10% of the weight as a rule of thumb. But what I usually do for a 4-inch shell is just use 2 ounces, and that's 56.7 grams. So that's what I've found to be a good lift amount. Okay, so once you have your powder measured out, we'll cut a section of quick match, and I know that a 4-inch tube, and the ones we use anyway, are 30 inches tall. So I've cut a piece that's approximately 40 inches of my quick match. I've also exposed a section of it on the end, and on the opposite end I've put a little piece of tape, so later on I don't have to worry about any spark getting to this. You take your exposed section of quick match, you lay it in your lift cup, and then we're just going to set the time fuse down in there. Okay, and so your quick match will be attached basically around to the top, and so your quick match to the top, and that's kind of what you end up with right here. So I'm simply going to tape this around there. We're going to make sure we secure the quick match really well, because typically you lower it down in there with the quick match and you don't want that tearing loose and pulling out. But when it's lit, it just simply travels around down into your lift cup and ignites your time fuse. At the same time, it sets off your lift charge. And so as it's rising in the air, the time fuse is burning up, and then once it goes in, gets up into your quick match that's inside, or your black match, then your shell explodes. So that's kind of how that works. And so what I'll do is go ahead and tape this up, and then I'll show you the finished shell. Okay, so here is the finished shell. I just went ahead and used the regular tape, and I taped around to hold the lift cup in place. Then I went back over it with some gum tape just to pretty it up. Make sure you secure the quick match well at the top. If it's a really heavy shell, a lot of times they will actually incorporate a loop of string in as they're taping it, and then they will run the quick match through that, and that gives it a place to pull on to take the tension off of it as you're loading it. Make sure you write on what it is. In this case, I just put 4-inch red, and bundled up the quick match so it's ready to store and ready to when I get ready to fire it. So when I get ready to fire it, if I'm going to use E-match, I just simply take this off and put the E-match in and tie it in place. If I'm going to hand fire these, I typically take a short piece of Visco and stick out of the quick match and just tape it in place. That gives you time to get away once it's lit. So that's pretty much it. That's our finished shell. And like I said, there's so much more you can do with it. There's so many different sizes you can make. But guess what? They are all basically the same. So anyway, enjoy. I'll try to shoot this later and film it, and then I'll show it to you. All right, thanks.